All right, guys, slightly longer video today. I was planning on doing this in two videos, but I'm actually just going to do it in one. So first we're going to talk about Americans in the end of World War II, and then after that we'll talk a little bit about the post-war world. In this first section, thinking about the big idea here of American involvement in World War II as being essential to the Allies winning. In Europe, American invasion at Normandy, France, was kind of the beginning of the end for Hitler and for the Nazis. And in the Pacific, the U.S. is going to change the entire world and all of history since 1945 with the atomic bomb. Some of the topics that we're going to cover here: multinational conferences, the military events in Northern Africa and Italy. We'll talk about D-Day and the victory in Europe, and then we'll talk a little bit about the war in the Pacific between the Japanese and the Americans, and then the atomic bomb as well. The American war effort started slowly. Britain had been fighting alone militarily in Europe, but American supplies helped sustain their resistance. Hitler unleashed his U-boats in the Atlantic with orders to sink any vessels carrying aid to Britain. However, superior tactics and technology from Britain and the United States led to their success in the Battle of the Atlantic. British codebreakers managed to decipher German radio communications, providing a surge of intelligence. Coupled with extensive naval convoys protected by destroyers equipped with sonar, the Allies gained the upper hand, and by 1942, Hitler's German Navy was losing ships faster than they could be replaced. In northern Africa in 1942, a crucial British victory at El Alamein began the process of pushing German forces back. In November, the first American combat troops arrived in Europe, landing in French Morocco and advancing eastward alongside British forces. By 1943, the Allies had expelled Axis forces from Africa altogether. In January, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill convened in Casablanca to plan the next phase of the European War, with Churchill persuading Roosevelt to pursue the Axis forces into Italy, targeting the soft underbelly of Europe. Roosevelt subsequently announced that the Allies would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. Meanwhile, the Army Air Force sent hundreds and eventually thousands of bombers to England, preparing for a significant strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The strategy involved bombing Germany continuously. American bombers engaged in strategic bombing, attacked German ball-bearing factories, rail yards, oil fields, and manufacturing centers during the day, while the British Royal Air Force conducted nighttime carpet bombings of German cities, often referred to as saturation bombing. At first, the bombers flew without escort, as many believed that bombers equipped with defensive armaments or defensive weapons would be too high and fast for enemy fighters to target. However, advanced German technology allowed their fighters to easily shoot down the slow-moving bombers. On some scary missions, the Germans shot down nearly 50% of American aircraft. The introduction of long-range escort fighters allowed bombers to strike more accurately while fending off German aircraft. Following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, the leaders of the Allies, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met in Tehran in November 1943. Dismissing the campaigns in Africa and Italy as distractions, Stalin insisted that Britain and the United States launch an invasion of France to take the pressure off the Soviets on the Eastern Front. While Churchill was reluctant, Roosevelt was enthusiastic. The invasion was tentatively set for 1944. In Italy, however, the soft underbelly proved much tougher than Churchill had anticipated. The narrow and mountainous landscape favored the defending Axis forces. Progress up the Italian peninsula was sluggish, and at times conditions resembled the trench warfare of World War I. American forces attempted to land troops on the western coast, but faced heavy casualties while being surrounded. Nevertheless, the Allies advanced up the peninsula, and Mussolini, the leader of Italy, his government fell, leading to a new Italian regime that quickly sought peace. As American forces entered Rome, American, British, and Canadian troops launched Operation Overlord, the long-anticipated invasion of France. Known as D-Day, this event marked the largest amphibious or water-based assault in history. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, uncertain about the invasion's success, prepared two speeches the night before, one for victory and one for defeat. On June 6, 1944, the Allied troops attacked 5 different beaches in Normandy, France, much to the surprise of the Germans, who expected an invasion at Calais, a different city in France. The invasion at Normandy included more than 4,400 ships and landing craft, aided by 11,000 planes, that led to the destruction of German defenses. On 4 of 5 beaches, defenses were relatively light, and the invasion involved few Allied casualties. However, on Omaha Beach, one of the beaches assigned to the Americans, soldiers stepped out of boats to attack a slope filled with mines. Many soldiers drowned as they stepped off the boats because their gear weighed too much for them to bear. Those who made it to the beaches faced an assault of German bullets, and artillery. Many Americans died at Normandy, but in the end, the Allies established a stronghold in Western Europe and were able to push across the continent. Progress across France was slower than expected, but Paris was liberated, or freed, approximately 2 months later. Allied bombing missions continued to devastate German cities and industrial infrastructure, resulting in the deaths of around 400,000 German civilians due to the bombings. The Nazi regime was collapsing on both fronts. Despite Hitler's attempts to regain control in the West, the Battle of the Bulge failed to push the Allies back to the English Channel, delaying the invasion of Germany, while the Soviet Union relentlessly advanced westward, seeking retribution for German war crimes. German counterattacks in the East could not halt the Soviet progress, extinguishing any remaining hopes Germany had of regaining power in Eastern Europe. As 1945 began, the end of the European War was in sight. The Big Three of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin convened again at Yalta in the Soviet Union, reaffirming their demand for Hitler's unconditional surrender and initiating plans for post-war Europe. The Soviet Union reached Germany in January, and American forces crossed the Rhine River in March. In late April, American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River, while the Soviets, under Stalin's orders, aimed to capture Berlin first. They took the capital city in May, shortly after Hitler and his inner circle committed suicide in a bunker. Germany was defeated, and the European War was over. Allied leaders gathered once more at Potsdam, Germany, where they decided to divide Germany according to the current Allied occupation, including a divided Berlin pending future elections. Stalin also agreed to join the fight against Japan in approximately 3 months. Moving over to the Pacific. As Americans celebrated Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, their focus shifted entirely to the ongoing war in the Pacific. Similar to the European theater, the war in the Pacific began slowly. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American-held Philippines fell to Japan. After exhausting their ammunition and supplies, American and Filipino soldiers surrendered, and the prisoners were forced to march 80 miles to a prisoner of war camp without food, water, or rest. 10,000 died during the Bataan Death March. However, as Americans mobilized their military, the tide of the war began to turn. In summer of 1942, American naval victories at the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway severely weakened Japan's naval capabilities in the Pacific. To liberate the Pacific from Japanese control, the U.S. military initiated an island-hopping strategy, attacking one island after another, bypassing the strongest ones, while capturing those with airfields to continue pushing Japan out of the region. Combat was brutal. At Guadalcanal, American soldiers witnessed Japanese troops launching suicidal charges rather than surrendering. Many Japanese soldiers refused to be captured or to take prisoners. This mindset, combined with American prejudice, made the Pacific theater a more savage conflict compared to the European theater. Japanese defenders fought fiercely. Japanese forces inflicted significant casualties on American troops during their advance across the Pacific. At Iwo Jima, a small island of volcanic rock, 17,000 Japanese soldiers held off 70,000 Marines for over a month, causing nearly 30,000 American casualties before the island was taken. By February 1945, American bombers were within striking distance of Japan's mainland. Despite high casualties, bombers targeted Japan's industrial sectors. To protect bomber crews from risky daylight raids and maximize destruction against Japan's wooden cities, many American bombers released incendiary or fire-based bombs, igniting massive firestorms that devastated Japanese urban areas. Over 60 cities in Japan were firebombed, resulting in the deaths of around 100,000 civilians in Tokyo alone in March of 1945. In June 1945, after 80 days of fierce fighting and countless casualties, American forces captured the island of Okinawa. The path to Japan's mainland was now open, providing a potential base for a full-scale invasion to end the war. Estimates regarding the cost of invading Japan's mainland varied. Some officials anticipated that such an invasion could result in 500,000 American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese civilian deaths. Historians debate the motivations behind the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan. Many American officials criticized this choice, but these casualty estimates were later cited by military leaders to justify their actions. Early in the conflict, fearing that Germany might develop an atomic bomb, the U.S. government initiated the Manhattan Project, an ambitious and costly program aimed at harnessing atomic energy to create a weapon capable of annihilating entire cities. The first successful detonation of a nuclear device, known as Trinity, occurred in New Mexico in July 1945. Physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, who led the Los Alamos laboratory where the bomb was developed, later recalled that the experience reminded him of a Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 2 additional bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, were constructed and detonated over 2 Japanese cities in August. Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th, resulting in the deaths of over 100,000 civilians, while Nagasaki was attacked on August 9, leading to approximately 80,000 civilian fatalities. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15. On September 2, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, representatives from the Japanese government formally signed their surrender. World War II was finally over. All right, moving into this next part here, talking about the war after World War II and what it looks like for people to kind of seek peace in that time. This part's going to be relatively short, and we're going to focus primarily on the United Nations. After World War II, the world's kind of struggling to figure out what peace might look like. You want to remember, after World War I, they developed the League of Nations, but clearly that doesn't work because World War II still takes place. Big topic here, Roosevelt and the United Nations. That's kind of what we're getting into. After the war ended, Americans celebrated. Both in the United States and overseas, people aimed to establish a new order that would ensure peace worldwide and prosperity at home. Although the partnership with Stalin's Soviet Union would eventually break down, Americans sought ways to provide stability and economic security for veterans returning from the conflict. The failure of the League of Nations to prevent aggression from Germany, Italy, and Japan led many to doubt the effectiveness of any global organization in maintaining peace. This skepticism included President Franklin Roosevelt, who, as Woodrow Wilson's Undersecretary of the Navy, witnessed the American public and Senate reject the idea of collective security. We're thinking about the League of Nations and the United States rejecting that after World War I. In 1941, Roosevelt believed that security after the war could be achieved through an informal agreement among what he referred to as the 4 policemen, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, rather than through a revitalized League of Nations. However, others like Secretary of State Cordell Hull and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill disagreed, persuading Roosevelt to advocate for a new global organization. As the war progressed, Roosevelt began to support this idea, which mirrored a shift in public opinion. Pollster George Gallup observed a profound change in American attitudes. After World War I, the U.S. had rejected the League of Nations, and by 1937, only a third of Americans supported joining such an organization. Yet, as the conflict erupted in Europe, support rose to half the population. With America's entry into World War I, the support swelled, and by 1945, 81% favored the establishment of a new international body, which would eventually become the United Nations. Regardless of his prior views, Roosevelt had consistently expressed enthusiasm for the principles later enshrined in the United Nations Charter. In January 1941, he presented his 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, rights that he believed should be granted to all people worldwide. That same year, he signed the Atlantic Charter with Churchill, reinforcing these principles and introducing the concept of self-determination, along with commitments to post-war cooperation in the economic and political matters. Roosevelt initially used the term United Nations to refer to the Allied powers, not the subsequent post-war organization that we think of today, but the name persisted. In 1943, at the Tehran Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill persuaded Stalin to send a Soviet delegation, or a group of Soviets, to a meeting at the Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. in August 1944, where they outlined the basic structure of the new organization. This included a Security Council comprising the original 4 policemen plus France to discuss how to maintain peace and when to use military force. One historian noted that this organization reflected the understanding that only the great powers working together could provide real security. The plan was to blend Roosevelt's policeman concept with a global organization of equal representation. Additionally, there would be a German assembly with representatives from all nations, an international court of justice, and a council for economic and social matters. The Dumbarton Oaks Conference had mixed results, particularly with the Soviet concerns about the Security Council's function, but the nations agreed to reconvene or come together in San Francisco from August to June in 1945 for further discussions. There, on June 26, 1945, 50 nations signed the UN Charter, creating the United Nations, which persists to this day. The United States entered the war during a severe economic depression and emerged into an unprecedented economic boom. The conflict was won, the U.S. was stronger than ever, and Americans anticipated a prosperous future. However, new challenges emerged. Stalin's Soviet Union and the spread of nuclear weapons threatened post-war aspirations for global peace. Additionally, Americans who fought for democracy abroad would find that that same democracy undermined worldwide by re-established colonial regimes or superpower nations that were controlling other nations, and at home through segregation and injustice. The war unleashed powerful forces that would transform the United States both domestically at home and internationally. All right, this wraps up our videos here for World War II. We'll talk more about this in class tomorrow. Thanks for watching these, and we'll discuss more in the future.